I've been sitting on the bench for a long time, long enough to see patterns that most people miss, long enough to recognize the moment someone walks into my courtroom believing the rules that apply to everyone else simply don't apply to them. But I have to tell you, I've never seen anyone arrive quite the way Diane Hargrove arrived on that Tuesday morning. Diane Hargrove was the wife of Police Commissioner Richard Hargrove, the most powerful law enforcement figure in the state, a man whose influence stretched from the precinct houses of the city's poorest neighborhoods all the way to the mahogany paneled offices of the state capitol. And Diane had spent 22 years making absolutely certain that everyone within 100 miles understood exactly what that meant. She walked into my courtroom, not hurried, not nervous. She walked with the measured, deliberate pace of someone who has never needed to rush because the world has always been willing to wait. Her suit was a deep charcoal Armani pressed to geometric perfection. Her diamond earrings caught the courtroom lighting with every slight turn of her head, small, calculated flashes of wealth that said everything she needed them to say without a single word. She carried one leather folder, slim, nearly empty, held loosely at her side, the way you carry something you brought only as a formality. Because Diane Hargrove didn't need evidence. Evidence was for people who had to convince someone. Diane only needed to remind people of who her husband was, and the world rearranged itself accordingly. I watched her scan the courtroom, not the way a nervous litigant scans looking for reassurance, but the way a property owner surveys their estate, cataloging everything present, finding nothing particularly impressive, confirming that her arrival remained the most significant event in the room. The audience members, the production staff, the bailiff standing near my bench, she registered each of them with the same brief, dismissive interest a person might give to furniture. Then she glanced at Rosa Mendez. Rosa sat at the plaintiff's table with both hands folded over a thick folder of documents, her eyes red and swollen from crying she had clearly been doing long before this morning. Diane looked at Rosa the way you look at an inconvenience, and then she looked away. But then she did something that made my entire courtroom shift. Before I had even called the case, before the proceedings had formally opened, before a single word had been entered into the record, Diane Hargrove leaned toward my bench with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to having quiet words in powerful rooms. And she said it clearly enough that the microphones caught every syllable. Judge, I'd strongly advise you to wrap this up quickly and in my favor. My husband has friends everywhere, including people who decide which shows stay on the air. I felt the room suspend, every person present holding completely still, as if movement itself might disturb what had just been said. I've been doing this for 35 years. I faced down mob lawyers, convicted felons, pathological liars, Hollywood executives. But this was something different. I tilted my head slowly to one side and smiled. Not a warm smile, not an amused smile. The particular smile of a predator who has just watched its prey walk directly into a trap that has been carefully set and patiently waited upon. I didn't respond to the threat. I didn't need to yet. I just wrote something down, set my pen aside, and folded my hands on the desk with the absolute stillness of someone who has all the time in the world and all the evidence she needs. What Diane Hargrove could not possibly know as she settled into the defendant's chair was that I had not slept properly in 3 nights. Not because I was anxious, because I had been working. My research team had spent 72 hours building a file so comprehensive, so precise, and so devastating that 4 different people who reviewed it had independently used the same word to describe what it contained. The word was explosive. The folder sitting beneath my bench was not thin. It was 4 inches of documented truth about Diane Hargrove, her husband's office, and a decade of coordinated institutional power used as a private weapon against anyone who dared step out of line. And every single page of it was about to be used with the methodical, surgical precision of someone who has been waiting for exactly this moment. But let me tell you who was really sitting at that plaintiff's table. Rosa Mendez, 44 years old, school nurse, mother, the quietest kind of brave. She had not come here to perform. She had come here because every other door in the city had been shut in her face, one by one, with the kind of coordinated efficiency that only happens when someone very powerful has decided you need to be silenced. And she had the photographs, the documents, and the timeline to prove exactly how it was done and exactly who did it. Subscribe right now because what you're about to witness will shock you. 6 months before that Tuesday morning in my courtroom, Rosa had stayed late at the school to complete student health records. The following morning, walking to the supply closet, she opened a door and found 2 uniformed officers from Commissioner Hargrove's department inside a storage room, meeting with a man she recognized from a gang violence awareness presentation. The recognition was immediate and unmistakable. She saw that face, heard his name spoken, and suddenly understood what was happening. Rosa stood in that doorway for perhaps 3 seconds before one of the officers told her to close the door. She did. But that night, she made a decision that would cost her almost everything. She went back with her phone. Through a small gap, she photographed what she saw: the officers, the man, the documents on the table, every face, every page, identifiable. Then she did something that took courage most of us will never need to find. She went to the Civilian Oversight Board, the only independent body operating outside the commissioner's direct jurisdiction. 14 days later, she was suspended from her position on fabricated misconduct charges. Her nursing license was flagged for administrative review. Her landlord doubled her rent and initiated eviction. Her attorney, who had agreed to take her case, received a visit from 2 plainclothes officers. He withdrew by email the next morning, citing irreconcilable scheduling conflicts. Rosa had no money, no connections, no father who spent 30 years collecting favors. What she had was a phone with photographs, a folder of documentation, and a belief so deeply embedded in her that it functioned less like hope and more like a biological fact, that truth eventually goes somewhere, that it eventually finds a door that opens. She had tried every door in the city. Every single one had been closed. She came to my courtroom because it was the only one left. What Diane Hargrove did not know was that 3 weeks before that Tuesday morning, a former city internal affairs investigator named Daniel Marsh had walked into my production offices carrying a file he had spent 18 months building. Daniel had kept copies of everything when he resigned rather than participate in the burial of a witness intimidation complaint. He had documented financial transfers between the police union's political action committee and Diane's Hargrove Community Foundation. Sworn statements from 6 former city employees who had been targeted within 60 days of filing complaints. A paper trail connecting 4 separate professional licensing reviews to anonymous complaints filed from an email address registered to a server located inside the commissioner's own administrative building. When I reviewed the initial complaint, I recognized immediately that what was in front of me was not a harassment dispute. It was the visible surface of something much larger and much older. I prepared the way a person prepares for something they understand may be the most consequential thing they do in a very long time. Every page, every document, every date, every name verified and cross-referenced. And when I walked into my courtroom that Tuesday morning and watched Diane Hargrove perform her entrance, I already knew everything. Diane's opening statement was a masterclass in arrogance, so thoroughly marinated in privilege that it no longer recognized itself as arrogance at all. She spoke with the warm, measured authority of someone who had delivered too many charity gala speeches. She described herself as a community leader, a philanthropist, and with a theatrical pause, a private citizen who had been targeted by a disgruntled former employee manufacturing allegations. She never once used Rosa's name. Throughout her entire statement, Rosa Mendes was referred to exclusively as this woman. This woman filed a complaint. This woman has a history of workplace difficulties. This woman is why we are all here today having this deeply unfortunate conversation. Deeply unfortunate. She used those exact words with the breezy dismissiveness of someone describing a minor scheduling conflict. The complete destruction of another human being's livelihood registers somewhere between inconvenient and mildly tedious. Then she produced 3 character reference letters and placed them on the table one by one. One from a sitting city councilman, one from the school district's board chairman, one from a retired federal judge. She folded her hands over them and leaned back slightly, the posture of a woman who considered the matter essentially concluded. Rosa's testimony was everything Diane's was not. Her voice broke within the first 30 seconds, and she made no attempt to stop it because there was nothing performed about her grief. She described the storage room, the faces, the documents, the 3 seconds before the officer told her to close the door. She described going home that night and making the decision to come back with her phone, knowing even as she did it, that it was the kind of decision that changes the shape of your life. She described filing the complaint and waiting, genuinely believing it would be handled. She described watching that assumption get taken apart piece by piece, not in a single dramatic moment, but slowly, methodically. Her children changed schools after being taunted in the hallways. Her mother called and asked in a voice barely above a whisper whether Rosa had done something wrong. Her hands shook visibly as she held her folder, and several audience members were no longer trying to hide that they were crying. I let the testimony settle for a moment. Then I turned to Diane with a tone so conversational it almost disguised itself as casual. Mrs. Hargrove, are you familiar with the city's Civilian Oversight Board complaint process? Diane's answer arrived on the back of a small, tolerant smile. Of course, it's largely a performative process. These boards rarely have any real authority. I nodded slowly and wrote something down. Every regular viewer of this program knows that nod. It does not mean agreement. It means you just said something you cannot take back, and I have written it down, and we will be returning to it. Hit that like button right now because you can feel what's coming. When Rosa began presenting her photographic evidence, Diane interrupted with a raised hand. Your Honor, those images are taken completely out of context, and I'd like to know how she obtained them legally. I stopped her with a single raised palm. Diane actually waved it off, a small dismissive flick of her wrist, the gesture of someone swatting away a comment from a subordinate. The bailiff took one visible step forward. The audience murmured. Diane did not notice either of these things. When I pressed Diane methodically through the timeline, the suspension filed 14 days after the complaint, the license review triggered by an anonymous filing, the attorney who withdrew by email the morning after receiving visitors, Diane leaned back in her chair and said it again. Judge, institutions protect themselves. That's not something I controlled. And I gently remind you that my husband oversees the department that provides security for this building. The courtroom did not go silent. It did something more complete than that. It held its breath. every person present understanding simultaneously that something had just been said that could not be unsaid in a room specifically designed to ensure that everything said was permanently recorded. I sat down my pen, I folded my hands on the desk, and I looked at Diane Hargrove for a long, long moment without speaking. The kind of silence that has weight, the kind that presses down on the person it is directed at. Diane held her smile for the first 4 seconds. By the 8th second, something behind her eyes had shifted almost imperceptibly. The first hairline crack in 22 years of undefeated certainty. Comment 1. Question right now if you can feel exactly what is building in this room, because I just heard everything I needed to hear. And what I pull from that folder next will make Diane Hargrove wish she had never once in her life learned the word courtroom. I reached beneath my bench and placed a folder on the desk in front of me. Not the thin procedural folders that appear in routine cases. A folder so thick, so visibly substantial that the sound it made setting down on the wooden surface carried across the entire courtroom. Diane Hargrove's eyes moved to it involuntarily, and in the half second before she reassembled her expression, something crossed her face that had not been there at any point in the preceding hour. Not fear exactly, something that arrived before fear. The faint, cold recognition that the room she was sitting in might not be operating according to the rules she had spent 22 years learning to control. It lasted less than a second. Then the composure returned. "Mrs. Hargrove," I said, my voice carrying the measured calm of someone who has been waiting a very long time for a very specific moment. "Before we continue, I'd like to share some information I've gathered about the context surrounding this case." I opened the folder and removed the first document, placing it flat on the record with the unhurried precision of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. It was a financial summary. 3 years of donation records from the Hargrove Community Foundation, cross-referenced against the city's active vendor contract registry. $340,000 in contributions received over 36 months from companies holding active city contracts issued through Commissioner Hargrove's office. I set it down and looked up. "Mrs. Hargrove, is it common for city contractors to donate to your personal foundation while simultaneously holding contracts approved by your husband's department?" Diane's first answer came smoothly, something about community investment and the long tradition of corporate philanthropy. Her second answer, when I asked the question again with slightly different framing, came more slowly. Her third answer, when I placed a second document beside the first, showing the specific dates the contracts were approved against the specific dates the donations were received, did not come at all. I did not press the silence. I moved to the next document. I read from 4 sworn statements, each from a former city employee who had filed formal misconduct complaints against the commissioner's office, and subsequently, within 60 days of filing, lost their positions, had professional licenses flagged for review, or faced unexpected legal action from parties with documented connections to the Hargrove Foundation's donor network. I did not editorialize a single word. I simply read the names and the dates. The complaint filed on March 4th, the termination notice issued on April 19th, the complaint filed on August 12th, the license review initiated on September 30th, the complaint filed on January 7th, the lawsuit served on February 28th. I read them in sequence, evenly, without inflection, and allowed the arithmetic of the pattern to make every argument that needed to be made. By the third name, the audience had gone completely still. By the fourth, Diane's attorney had placed his pen down on the table and had not picked it up again. Then I held up a single sheet of paper, a parking permit issued by the Commissioner's Department, registered to a vehicle belonging to Rosa's former attorney, time-stamped to the evening of the day he had received his unannounced office visit from two plainclothes officers, the same evening that preceded his withdrawal from Rosa's case by approximately 14 hours. I held it up long enough for the cameras to capture it clearly. Interesting timing, Mrs. Hargrove. I set it down. Diane's face had at some point in the preceding several minutes stopped performing warmth entirely. It was now performing control. The jaw slightly set, the eyes slightly fixed, the stillness of someone concentrating very hard on not allowing their expression to move. Anyone who had ever played high-stakes poker would have recognized it immediately. It was the face of someone who has just realized they are losing and is devoting every available resource to not letting that show. It looked nothing like the face that had walked into my courtroom. The two expressions were separated by 22 years of invulnerability, and that invulnerability was dissolving in real time. I turned to my bailiff. Please note for the record that this court's proceedings are fully recorded and that any statements made during these proceedings are part of the official permanent record. I turned back to Diane. Mrs. Hargrove, earlier this morning, prior to these proceedings opening, you made a reference to the security detail my husband oversees for this building. And during testimony, you referenced it a second time. I want to ask you directly for the record. Were you suggesting that your husband's position should in any way influence the outcome of these proceedings? Diane opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. The three-beat hesitation of someone cycling through possible answers and finding each one more dangerous than the last. I was simply stating a fact, she said finally. I nodded once slowly. Yes, I said, you were. Then I closed the folder. I set it aside, completely to the side, away from me, with the deliberate finality of someone putting down a tool they no longer need because the work it was required for has been completed. The courtroom registered this instinctively. Every person present understood without being told that what came next would not require documents. Turn on those notifications right now because the moment you've been waiting for is here. I leaned forward, both forearms on the desk, and fixed my eyes on Diane Hargrove with the absolute unblinking stillness of something that has been patient for a very long time and has now decided that patience is finished. My voice dropped to that register, the terrifyingly quiet one, the one that has made seasoned attorneys lose their train of thought for decades. The one that carried so much more weight than shouting precisely because it cost nothing to produce and communicated everything. Mrs. Hargrove, who do you think makes your husband possible? 9 words. The courtroom stopped breathing. Diane blinked. Her mouth moved, forming the beginning shape of a word that did not arrive because the question had no safe exit. Every possible answer walked directly into something I had already placed on the record. If she said the city, I would point to Rosa, to the oversight board, to every tax-paying, rule-following, good faith citizen that Rosa Mendes represented in that chair. If she said the law, I would point to the sworn statements, to the foundation payments, to the parking permit, time-stamped to the night an attorney was persuaded to abandon his client. If she said the people, 22 years of documented behavior toward the people was already sitting in a 4-inch folder 3 feet away. There was no answer. There was only the question hanging in the air like something structural, like a beam that had just been removed from a building that was still for one suspended moment standing. 15 seconds passed. 20. Diane's hands, which had been motionless and controlled through everything, began to move. Small, involuntary adjustments. Her fingers found the edge of her folder and straightened it unnecessarily. Her right hand moved to her left earring and touched it briefly. She reached slightly to her right for a glass of water that was not there, and the reaching hand found nothing and returned to the table. The cameras recorded all of it. 30 seconds. The audience was so silent that the ambient hum of the studio equipment was audible. 35 seconds. Diane's attorney leaned toward her and said something barely above a whisper. She gave a single, almost imperceptible shake of her head. When she finally spoke, the voice that came out was not the voice that had opened this morning's proceedings. It was not the charity gala voice. It was not the institutional authority voice. It was not the voice that had told me before proceedings had even formally opened to wrap this up in her favor. It was something stripped of all of that, smaller, flatter, carrying none of the architecture that had held it up. The public, she said. I looked at her for one more moment, then I said 4 words, then act like it. What happened to Diane Hargrove in the seconds that followed was not a dramatic collapse. It was not tears or shouting or the kind of visible breakdown that makes for clean television. It was something quieter and in its own way far more complete. The slow, visible deflation of a person watching the structure of their own invulnerability disassemble itself in real time, piece by piece, with nothing to be done about any of it. She did not sob. She went still. A different kind of still than the controlled stillness of 20 minutes ago. The stillness of someone who has just understood with sudden and total clarity that the next 72 hours of their life are going to happen to them entirely outside of their own control. For possibly the first time in 22 years, Diane Hargrove had no next move. And every camera in that room was pointed directly at her face as she arrived at that understanding. My ruling came without ceremony and without hesitation. Rosa Mendes was awarded full reinstatement, damages, lost wages, legal fees, and emotional distress totaling $87,000, the maximum amount within my jurisdiction. The financial documentation regarding the Hargrove Community Foundation was formally referred to the State Attorney General's office for independent review. And then I did something I had done only a handful of times in 25 years on television. I addressed the defendant, not about the case, but about her conduct inside my courtroom itself. Mrs. Hargrove, in 35 years of jurisprudence, I have had people threaten me with lawyers, with press, with money, and with God himself. You are the first person to threaten me with a security detail. I want you to know none of it worked. Not once, not ever. I noted formally for the record that the 2 references Diane had made to the commissioner's security oversight constituted attempted judicial intimidation, and that the complete transcript of the day's proceedings would be forwarded to the State Bar's Judicial Conduct Commission for review. The gavel came down. Rosa put her face in her hands and cried. Not the polite, composed crying of someone performing relief for a camera, the deep, full body kind, the crying of a person who has been carrying something enormous for so long that the muscles required to hold it have forgotten what it feels like to release. Several audience members were already in tears themselves. The bailiff looked straight ahead with the rigid focus of a man working very hard to maintain his professional composure. Smash that like button and comment, "Act like it," because those 4 words just changed everything. Diane Hargrove gathered her things in silence. She left the character reference letters on the table. She left the leather folder. She walked out of my courtroom without speaking to her attorney, without acknowledging Rosa, without the measured, deliberate pace that had carried her in. The cameras caught her in the hallway, standing completely still, not moving toward the elevator, not reaching for her phone, not speaking. Just standing as if she had arrived somewhere unfamiliar and could not immediately remember which direction she had intended to go. Within 3 hours, "Who do you think makes your husband possible?" was trending across 22 states. The clip hit 40 million views by midnight. 90 days later, the world Diane has spent 22 years building came apart quietly and completely. the state attorney general opened a formal investigation into the Hargrove Foundation. Commissioner Richard Hargrove announced voluntary leave, a phrase that fooled nobody. The two officers Rosa photographed were suspended. The school board chairman, who filed fabricated charges against Rosa, resigned before an ethics committee could compel his testimony. The attorney who abandoned Rosa's case faced a bar inquiry. Diane's charity gala season was canceled. The character reference letters vanished from public record. The city councilman stopped returning calls. Rosa went back to work. The settlement cleared her debt, secured her housing. Her license review was quietly dropped within 30 days. Her students made her a welcome back card. She keeps it on her desk next to her mother's photograph. This case proved one thing above everything else. People who use institutional power as a private weapon survive on a single belief: that no room exists where their reach doesn't extend. Diane Hargrove walked into the one room she forgot to account for, and inside it, 9 words and 35 seconds of silence destroyed everything that 22 years of untouchable arrogance had built. Subscribe right now for more justice served. Accountability always finds a door.
In the end, Diane Hargrove walked into the courtroom believing that influence could protect her, just as it had for 22 years. But one question changed everything. Who do you think makes your husband possible? After the evidence was placed on the record, the financial connections were exposed, and the intimidation tactics were documented, the power she had relied on began to disappear right in front of her. The judge ruled in Rosa Mendez's favor, awarding her reinstatement, lost wages, legal fees, emotional distress damages, and a total of $87,000. The financial records involving the Hargrove Community Foundation were referred to the state attorney general for independent review, while the judge also referred Diane's courtroom conduct to the state bar's Judicial Conduct Commission. For Rosa, this was more than a legal victory. It was the end of months of fear, retaliation, and uncertainty. She could finally return to work, clear her debts, and begin rebuilding the life that had been taken apart simply because she chose to speak up. And perhaps the biggest lesson from this case is simple: power only works when people believe they are powerless. Diane Hargrove walked into that courtroom expecting the room to bend around her influence. Instead, she discovered the one place where her name, her connections, and her husband's position could not protect her, the record. Because when the truth is documented, when someone is willing to stand up, and when accountability finally has a place to speak, even the most powerful people can be held responsible. If you believe no one should be above accountability, let us know in the comments. And for more dramatic courtroom stories, unexpected twists, and moments when justice turns the tables, subscribe and stay tuned for the next case.